Hello, I'm Mercedes Stevenson, and this is the West Block: politics, perspectives, and players. Last week, Moscow announced the start of mass vaccinations on volunteers for the Sputnik V COVID-19 vaccine. The Russian government has said that 40,000 people will receive the vaccine for free. While Russia has pushed ahead on an accelerated pace for the vaccine, 26 scientists have signed an open letter questioning the reliability of the data presented by the Russian government in the early stage trial results, saying the patterns in that data looked highly unlikely. Joining us to talk about this now is a scientist right here from the University of Ottawa, Raywat Deonandan. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
So we have heard all about this Russian vaccine. Now some questions about whether or not the data the Russians have been releasing looks convincing. What's your take on whether or not this Russian vaccine is legitimate?
It's a big question. First of all, the sample size for the phase 2 trial that they published is quite small, about 76 patients. You compare that to the Oxford AstraZeneca trial that was published back in June. They had over 1,000 patients, which is a better study. They also provided 128 additional pages of background material, raw data that independent scientists could prize through, and the Russians have not provided that. So there is certainly some missing stuff that they could provide. Some people think they've identified reproduced data. For example, several patients seem to have the same immune response, which is highly unlikely. So there may be some duplication of data that's being challenged and offered as a possible explanation. So I don't know. What we need is greater transparency and a better investigation into the peer review process here. It would help if they provided more information. It's as simple as that.
What is the risk of mass vaccinating people with this vaccine if you're not sure what some of the fallout might be?
Well, the reason we have phase 3 clinical trials is that we see how it works in the real world. Will it actually prevent people from getting sick? Phase 2 trials just determine if it can elicit an immune response. So let's say you've got 1 in 10,000 vaccinations gives you a really bad adverse reaction. That doesn't sound very bad, but if you scale that up to 1 million people who get the vaccine, that's 100 people with a bad experience. If you scale it up to billions of people on the planet, now hundreds of thousands of people are going to have very serious adverse reactions. So the phase 3 trial is critical for safety and for understanding if it actually works. Keep in mind, only about a third of drugs that do well in phase 2 trials end up passing muster in phase 3 trials. So it's really premature, in my reckoning, to skip phase 3 trial and go straight to market.
Well, and speaking of looking at some of the results of those trials, I believe it's the AstraZeneca trial where there were some concerns about neurological symptoms in one of the patients who had received the shot as part of these trials. How do you balance out the demand for a vaccine and a vaccine very quickly with the reality that there is a risk because this is a new vaccination?
That is a very good question. And people need to understand that to do this right, it's going to take a little bit of time. Now, we've cut some corners that we can cut, administrative corners. We started phase 3 trials before the phase 2 trials were published, which is the right thing to do to make sure that we have everything as streamlined as possible. The manufacturing capacity is up and running, ready to go the second that we have a good candidate. People need to keep in mind that the fact that the AstraZeneca trial was paused is a good thing. It means they're taking safety seriously. And clinical trial pauses happen all the time. We don't know what the details are for this pause. One patient supposedly had transverse myelitis, which is a fairly serious inflammation of the spinal cord, but it could have been in the control group. We don't know. It could have been unrelated to the vaccine. We don't know. If it is related to the vaccine, it's better that we know now than later. And it's better that we understand what kinds of people are more likely to have that reaction so we can protect those people. So people have to understand this is a critical stage before mass deployment to keep as many people safe as possible. So we balance it that way, understanding that risk is real. We can wait a few months as long as we do the right public health things to keep everybody else safe the traditional way before we unleash a new technology.
How realistic do you think it is that there will be a vaccine before the pandemic is over?
Well, a vaccine will be the cause of the pandemic being over. So a vaccine is our safest path to real herd immunity. We can get natural herd immunity from everyone getting infected, but then with the high infection fatality rate, that means a lot of death around the world. We don't want that. So artificial herd immunity we get from the vaccine, and that's how we end the pandemic. I think it's likely that we'll have a viable candidate on the market, on the global stage, by the middle of next year, if not a bit earlier. And then with deployment, transportation, immune response, etc., we may have sufficient numbers of people vaccinated to start thinking about not declaring the pandemic by the end of 2021. Maybe the beginning of 2022, we'll start seeing the pandemic being something in the past. I hate making predictions, but I just made one. Let's hope I'm right.
I also know that you had a chance to listen to our interview with Canada's Health Minister, Patty Hajdu. What did you make of what the minister had to say?
Well, this is 2020 and hindsight is 2020. So it's tempting to second guess decisions that were made by the health ministry and by the government early on this pandemic. I'm restraining myself a great deal, but it's clear now that we probably should have closed the borders earlier. We probably should have mandated mask wearing earlier. We should have compelled provinces to stop March break travel earlier. There are things we could have done. But I'm forgiving towards those mistakes because that was based on the information we had at the time. The other things, though, that were, I think, a bit of administrative misconduct, as it were, is the failure to invest heavily in a surveillance system. Our national surveillance systems have been consistently defunded, and I think that's an oversight. And I hope a pandemic scare like this convinces us that going forward, we need to put a lot of resources into keeping our eyes out in the world for new pandemics. Number two is there's always been two ways out of this: better testing and a vaccine. Now it's becoming clear that a vaccine is what the world wants. But until that arrives, our ability to test rapidly and at scale is critical. So the government could have done and still can do a better job in accessing all the test kits they can, in financing and resourcing the labs to process those tests, and in getting the new testing technologies, the rapid test kits, the saliva test kits, the at-home tests, the antibody tests. All that stuff is still in our power to get done. And of course, the vaccine is a critical component to all this. The deals we had early on with CanSino, for example, didn't pan out. That was a bad call. We don't seem to have deals on the table to get access to the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is probably a mistake. So we're scrambling, it seems to me, to get these other candidates. We need to get as many candidates as we can secured so that Canadians have access to the best possible cures, therapies, and vaccines on the market. So there are things we can do still to overcome the failures that we have made so far.
Doctor, thank you so much for your time and your insight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for watching. I'm Mercedes Stevenson, and we'll see you here back next week on the West Block.